Welcome back. I'm Barry Craig. Have you ever wondered why a jaguar has spots, why an eagle has dark feathers, and why a mother never knows if she's going to have a boy or a girl? My guest today, Charlie Goff, an anthropologist, is going to tell us all about that. He has been visiting campus recently, and he decided to come in and share some of his experiences with us, and we're glad to have him. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
First, tell us where you came from and how you got here to West Kentucky Community and Technical College.
Well, I work with a school in Cuernavaca, Mexico. It's in central Mexico, about 50 miles south of Mexico City, on the road to Acapulco. And earlier this year, in March, we had the opportunity to host a program from West Kentucky. And this visit grew out of that. And we had, I think it was 12 people in the group.
Right.
We traveled in central Mexico for a week, visited archaeological sites, historical places, museums. Students lived with Mexican families. And I was invited up for this Hispanic Cultural Week.
And we heard, by the way, we heard very good reports about that. So you got an A+.
Thank you.
Now let's go back again, and this one of the programs that you did was talking about these very things. Mm-hmm. So let's just go through these one at a time. Why does a jaguar have spots? Why does an eagle have dark feathers? And why does a mother wonder if she's going to have a boy or a girl? Mm-hmm. And where does that come from?
Well, you know that we're living under the fifth sun.
Didn't know that.
There have been 4 suns before ours, and there have been 4 humanities before ours. Ours is the 5th. It's a combination of the previous ones. First, the Mesoamerican gods tried making people out of mud, and they didn't worship the gods as they should, and so that time period came to an end, and they were washed back by mud with heavy rainstorms. They were wishy-washy people. And then the gods tried making people out of wood. They were like mindless mannequins, and they were destroyed by fire. Then they tried making people out of flesh, and they were evil people. They turned to wickedness. Their time period came to an end too. The 4th time, the gods made people out of corn dough, and they were the good people.
Corn dough?
Yes. The same dough that you make tortillas out of. But their time period came to an end too. And this humanity that we live in is a combination of all of the previous ones. That's why we have some wishy-washy people. We have some people that are like mindless mannequins. We have some evil people. And we have some good people, descendants of ones that wrote the story.
That's great.
But the last time, the sun only commits itself to ruling over the earth for 52 years at a time. That's 18,980 trips through the sky. The sun can never be late, never gets a day off. Has to put up with the constant chit-chat of the council of the gods that accompanies it through the sky. It's understandable that the god of the sun might not want to return after 52 years of that. It only does return because of all of the offerings that people promise to give the sun in exchange for coming and ruling over life on earth. Mm-hmm. And so it comes back, and each time it does come back for the new 52-year cycle, people are relieved that life will continue for another 18,980 days.
What's interesting is in so many ancient cultures, there is a sun god. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's obvious that the sun is the source of life. Yeah.
But this last time that the sun didn't come back, the earth was plunged into darkness. And the gods realized they soon would be dying of starvation. If there were no people here on earth to feed the gods, how were they going to be surviving? They called an emergency meeting at Teotihuacan. Maybe you've been to Teotihuacan. Certainly many of your viewers have, where the pyramids of the sun and moon are outside of Mexico City. And they met in the dark. They had to illuminate their fire. They were meeting with a fire. Sat around a huge bonfire. Imagine a circle of gods sitting around the fire. It was obligatory attendance for all gods. So all of them were sitting there except for one. One had to sit a bit farther from the fire. His name was Nana Watson. His body was all covered with sores and pus, and he looked terrible. No god would sit next to him. They would have preferred he hadn't shown up, but he had to be there. And this, of course, attracted the attention of all of the animals. They came to see what the meeting was about. So imagine a fire in the middle and the circle of gods, and one god a bit farther from the rest, and then the circle of animals. And discussion focused on how are we going to create this new sun. And the suggestion was presented, why don't we open it up to volunteers, and whoever wants to jump into the fire and be burned completely will have the honor of being the sun for the next humanity. And another god suggested, why limit it to one? If we have more than one sun, we won't have this problem again. If one sun decides not to come back, we'll still have the replacement sun. And that was approved too. And it came time for the volunteers, and Tegucigalpa, a young and handsome and very wealthy god, stood up and he said, I'll be glad to be the sun. And he said, once I throw myself into this fire, I'll have no more use for all these things that make me so wealthy. So if it would be agreeable to you, sister and brother gods, I'll be glad to give you each a gift of appreciation. And before the words were almost out of his mouth, the gods were nodding their approval to that idea, and he started going around the circle, giving out quetzal feathers and jade jewelry and gold jewelry and all kinds of precious things. And the gods were all very pleased with these gifts that they were each getting from him, individually, personally. And to their dismay and horror, they heard the voice of Nana Watson from behind them, and he said, I too volunteer, and I'll be glad to throw this horrible body into the fire and have it burn completely. And you didn't put a price on what it costs to be the sun, so you can't be expecting anything of me. You know that I'm the poorest of the gods. And the gods had to agree that his logic was correct, and they certainly should have come up with better guidelines right from the very beginning to make sure that he couldn't have volunteered, but it was too late now. But one god did speak up, and he said, but they should jump into the fire in the same order in which they volunteered. That would guarantee that Tegucigalpa would be the principal son, and Nana Watson would be the second replacement son, if needed. And came time, there were no other volunteers, and came time to jump into the fire. Tegucigalpa was first, and he started running towards the fire. Nana Watson was right behind him, running towards the fire too. And when they got close to the fire, Tegucigalpa realized how painful this was really going to be. And he came to a screeching halt. Nana Watson was running as fast as the wind. He couldn't stop. He was either going to run into stationary Tegucigalpa right in front of him, or he was going to have to dive over him and into the fire. That's what he did. And there was a flash of light and flame when he hit the fire. And the gods in the meeting all started to laugh at Tegucigalpa for having been outdone by, of all gods, Nana Watson. He asked for a second chance. It was given to him, and he too jumped into the fire. And there was another flash of light when that happened. Two of the animals followed the example of those two gods. They jumped into the fire too. And the eagle jumped into the center of the fire and was burned completely. That's why the eagle has dark feathers. Mm-hmm. The jaguar only made it into the coals. And that's why the jaguar's skin is spotted. But they burned in the same fire that these two suns burned in. Now there was nothing to do but just wait, see if it was going to work. All eyes were focused on the horizon in the east. And sure enough, after a little while, there was a radiant light in the east, and sunrise occurred. The gods were delighted. It had worked. There was a new sun, and life would be able to continue. And shortly after sunrise, there was sunrise again. And those two gods made their way up into the center of the sky. There was noon, followed by noon, and sunset was followed by sunset. Following morning, sunrise, followed by sunrise. This went on for a few days, but at about third or fourth day, those two gods ran out of energy, and they just sat down at about 10 o'clock and 10 o'clock. And they couldn't take another step. And the gods were still at the meeting, of course. They had many things on their agenda to take care of. And they said, this can't go on. We're going to burn up. Imagine what it was like in the tropics with 2 stationary suns at 10 o'clock in the morning. And they said, we've got to do something. And so it was Quetzalcoatl, the god of the feathered serpent, who stood up and he said to his sister and brother gods, if you'll approve, I'll be glad to pierce my skin and can draw some blood, and we'll put it on a piece of bark paper and give it to Chocmol, the messenger of the gods, and have him deliver it to the 2 sons, and they will have energy. They'll be able to keep on walking. Nobody else had any better ideas, and so that was done, and some blood was delivered, and sure enough, shortly after receiving it, the 2 gods got up and kept on going through the sky. And they still had many things to take care of. They had to create a whole new humanity, and if they didn't do it soon, the gods would be dying of starvation with no offerings. But you can't keep a meeting going on forever. People had to take a break. Gods do too. And so they said, let's meet back at noon tomorrow. And most of them were back at noon. A little while later, others straggled in, and the ones that were there on time commented and asked them, don't you realize the importance of this meeting? You're getting here late. And they said, didn't you say that the meeting would start at noon? And the others said, yes. And they pointed up. And they, did you mean noon by the first sun? We thought you meant noon by the second sun. And things were getting very complicated with having 2 suns. It would be like having daylight savings time and standard time at the same time. And so they decided this couldn't go on. And they gave Chocmol, the messenger of the gods, another assignment, to go out and snuff out the face of the second sun with the skin of a rabbit. And despite all the centuries that have passed since that meeting, still today you can see the scorch mark of the rabbit on the face of the full moon. Step outside the next time you have a chance to see a full moon. It's very clear. And they snuffed out the face of Tegucigalpa, who now just follows along behind Nanahuatzin, reflecting Nanahuatzin's light. Tegucigalpa became the moon.
Wow, it's a great story.
Mm-hmm.
So now about the mother and the children. How does that
Oh,
go?
yes, the mother not knowing. Well, they needed to create a new humanity. Had to be done quickly. Quetzalcoatl, that same god that pierced his skin and drew his blood, he stood up at the meeting and he said, I'll be glad if you sister and brother gods give me the approval to do so, I'll be glad to go down into the realm of the dead and find the bones of my mother and my father. And from them I can create a new humanity. Nobody else had any better ideas, and he was authorized to do so. And he set off on the long trip that we as people will have to go on someday. Unless we happen to offer our heart sacrifice at the temple, or warriors that die in battle, or women that die in childbirth, and priests, they all go to be with the sun directly. But most everybody else goes on a long and dangerous trip after death. It takes you over high mountain passes and crossing glaciers. On a clear day in Mexico City, there are glaciers to be seen on the top of Ixtlacihuatl volcano. And you almost die frozen to death crossing the glacier. This is after you're dead already. And somehow you make it across the glacier, and just about when you're about to keel over dead, you get to the blazing desert, and you almost die of thirst crossing the desert, and you get attacked by wild animals and hopelessly lost on the many trails in the desert, and rattlesnakes and everything else. And just when you're about to keel over from thirst, you get to the raging river, and you almost drown crossing the river. Every possible thing that can go wrong on that trip after death. You have to get down to the 9th level of the underworld, where once you get there, you will live out the rest of time with everything provided for you. But it's quite a trial to get there. And if you have led a bad life and have committed many sins, if you want to call them sins, your trip after death will be very difficult.
That sounds very much like purgatory.
It's very much like purgatory, and
I think, of course, the 9 circles of hell in Dante.
And yet, anthropologists are repeat over and over again that it occurs throughout Mesoamerica, and they do think that it's an authentically Mesoamerican idea, and it wasn't introduced by the Spaniards immediately after the conquest. But it's one of those many things that that blends very well with Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And if you'd led a good life, your trip would be easy. You wouldn't have any trouble.
Not as much time in purgatory.
Quetzalcoatl was a god, though. And yet he had never been on this trip before and would have no reason to go on it because he wouldn't be dying. Gods never aged. But nevertheless, he had to go there to get the bones of his mother and his father. He took his dog along to serve as his guide and his watchdog. And he didn't have too much trouble. They made it within good time. And upon arriving at the 9th level of the underworld, he introduced himself to the god of death. And with all proper protocol and due respect, he said, I've come with the authorization of the Council of the Gods to take the bones of my mother and my father. And from them, I'm going to create a new humanity. And the god of death said, yes, I know. I was at that meeting. I was wondering when you were going to show up. Of course, he had not been generous in showing Quetzalcoatl the shortcuts and how to get there quickly. And he said, you're welcome to those bones. Go ahead and take them. Quetzalcoatl thanked him. And just as he was turning to go off in search of the bones, he heard the voice of the god of death saying, but you know that nobody, not even a brother god, is authorized to touch the bones once I have acquired them. If you can take them without touching them, you're welcome to them. Quetzalcoatl realized he was caught in a riddle. And that was indeed true. He knew that was true. And there was just an oversight at the Council of the Gods that he hadn't been authorized to touch the bones. He had only been authorized to take them. He knew that if he went back to the meeting, they would certainly give him the approval. How else would he be able to take them? And yet there was no time. Gods would soon be dying of starvation if there were no people here on earth to be making offerings to the gods. He decided he was going to have to steal the bones. The ends would justify the means. And he whispered to his dog to go off and find the bones of his mother and his father. And he snuck off away from the god of death. And soon the dog reported back that he had identified both skeletons, and he led Quetzalcoatl to his father's skeleton first. And he very carefully picked up the skeleton. He draped it over one arm. And he picked up his mother's skeleton and draped it over his other arm. And he was making his way out of the realm of the dead, keeping all of the bones in their proper order. And the god of death saw what was happening, and he started chasing Quetzalcoatl, who in turn had to pick up the pace and start running. And in the darkness, he tripped and stumbled. And the bones just scattered every which way, and some of them got broken. Mother's bones got mixed up with father's bones, and all he could do now was quickly pick up the bones and throw them into the bag that he was carrying over his shoulder. And he barely made it out in the nick of time, just before the god of death was about to catch him. And he got back to this flat level of the earth that we live on. He then pierced his skin. He drew some of his own blood, and he sprinkled it on the bones, and from them he created this humanity that we are a part of. But it's because of that accident of mother's bones getting mixed up with father's bones that a mother never knows whether her child's going to be a boy or a girl. And because some of the bones broke, some people are taller in stature and some people are shorter in stature. But he was able to create this humanity that we are a part of.
That's a great story. I can see why you got into anthropology. What a terrific discipline that is. How did you get into anthropology, by the way? You told me before that your parents were Presbyterian ministers in Colombia. And so how did you become an anthropologist?
My parents worked in Colombia for 21 years. I was born in Colombia, South America. I finished high school in Bogota. And when I finished high school, my parents moved to Cuernavaca, and still assigned by the Presbyterian Church, but now to work with Ivan Illich. And he had invited them to go to Cuernavaca and set up a library on the church and social change in Latin America. And furthermore, the Presbyterian Church, through the National Council of Churches, had them set up seminars for missionaries and put them in touch with new Latin American theological ideas. I was in my first year of college in Los Angeles. And my sister was in Los Angeles too, and we went to Cuernavaca to visit our parents for the first Christmas that they were there. They took me out to some archaeological sites.
And you were hooked.
And I had been majoring in economics and found anthropology much more interesting. And I took some anthropology classes in California, and then I went to Mexico City. And it was even more fascinating there at National University, there's a school for foreign students, and our professors were the people that had actually done the work. And we were in class with the people that had restored the pyramids and worked on site.
Mm-hmm.
It became very interesting.
That's another thing too. It's really obvious. You have the Egyptian pyramids, you have the pyramids in Mexico. What is it about pyramids that fascinated ancient peoples?
The pyramids in Egypt and the pyramids in Mesoamerica are very different. The pyramids in Egypt seem to be tombs.
Mm-hmm.
And the pyramids in Mesoamerica, although some of them do have tombs in them, and with just a few exceptions, most of those tombs were put into the building after they had been built, by digging a tunnel or by digging down from the top and burying somebody in them. The function wasn't to be a tomb. The function was to get the temple up high and above the surrounding terrain. An interesting thing about Mesoamerican pyramids is that if you do visit many different sites, in some places the pyramids are low, some places the pyramids are much taller. But what they always seem to do is get you up above the surrounding vegetation and allow you to get a clear view of the horizon, and probably served as observatories to make astronomical observations on the horizon. If you don't have the specialized equipment that astronomers today have, telescopes and lenses and things like that, it's difficult to make an observation in the center of the sky with accuracy. Much easier to do it on the horizon through landmarks in the distance, the sun or the moon or planets setting between peaks on the horizon, and you can be quite accurate that way. But there are sort of two basic schools of thought in Mesoamerican anthropology. The diffusionists are one group, and the ones that defend the autochthonous development of the Mesoamerican cultures are another. Most of the diffusionists are European, and most of those that defend the local development of the cultures are from this hemisphere. And it seemed, especially earlier in the 20th century, very difficult for Europeans to accept the idea that Mesoamericans could reach the heights that they reached in mathematics and astronomy and architecture without the help of people from across the ocean. The most famous of the diffusionists is Paul Kirchhoff, who interestingly is the one that came up with the word Mesoamerica to refer to the part of this hemisphere where high cultures developed. But his basic idea was that there's a plentiful rainy season in Mesoamerica, no reason to have a calendar as accurate as the Mesoamericans had, whereas the Egyptians did need a calendar. The Egyptians needed to know when the Nile was going to flood. And if they didn't have their seeds in the ground before it flooded, they would die of starvation. And yet there was no way of knowing unless you kept track of a calendar. You wouldn't know when the Nile was going to flood. It was very important for them to keep an accurate calendar. And from there, he says, the calendar spread across Mesopotamia, India, Southeast Asia, and somehow jumped across the Pacific. And the Mesoamericans picked it up from what was coming from Egypt. And the archaeologists that defend the local development of the Mesoamerican culture point out that likewise in Mesoamerica, with a torrential tropical downpours during the rainy season, and having to clear land on which you're going to farm from the rainforest, you want to clear your land early in the dry season, let it dry out. If it doesn't dry out completely, it's not going to burn well just before you plant your seeds, and yet you want to let it dry out as much as possible because that'll give you more farmland. And if you could keep track of the way the sun is moving through the sky, you'd be able to tell when the rainy season was about to begin. When the sun is directly overhead Copan, one of the southernmost Maya cities, the rainy season is just about to begin on the sun's apparent trip north on its way to the Tropic of Capricorn. And that could have been the basic reason for keeping track of time and setting the fields on fire, and then you'd have, with the slash and burn type of agriculture, you'd have a place to farm. And so even though both cultures did build pyramids, they are very different. An Egyptian pyramid has to be built on a perfectly flat surface, otherwise all four sides won't peak at the same point. It's a geometric pyramid. Mesoamerican pyramids are called pyramids for lack of a better word. They should probably be called mounds. or platforms. And it doesn't make any difference if the surface is flat or uneven. It can work out.
The other thing too that struck me is the idea, of course, the Christian notion of heaven is in the sky. Was that also true in Mesoamerica, the notion of heaven, the afterlife is in the sky?
It is, except for people that die by forces of water. And they were being called by the god of rain to come and be with him. Those were people that died by drowning, from being struck by lightning, or from diseases where their bodies bloated with fluids. They were the fortunate few who were being invited by the rain god to come and be with him directly, with no dangerous trip after death. And they live the rest of eternity somewhere on this flat earth in an area that's inaccessible to us as living people. All of the others, well, there was the underworld, the ninth level of the underworld for the great majority of the people. And
what that fascinates me, because in Dante's Inferno, it's the 9 circles of hell. Yes. Is there anything about the number 9 that is a tie-in there, or is that just a coincidence?
For the Mesoamericans, 9 was a sacred number, as was 13, and 7, and 4, and 5. And it all comes from those levels of the heavens and the underworlds. The sun starts out in the east in the morning and climbs a giant stairway up to the top at the 7th level, and then goes down 6 steps to sunset, giving you 13 hours in a day. And then the sun has to be back in the east by morning, though. One legend says that it transforms itself into a jaguar who has a skin that's like the night sky, black with white spots on it. And being the fastest animal, it could be back in the east by morning. But that's just a legend, because we know that the sun continues underneath our flat earth and goes down a stair, down 5 steps down to the lowest level of the underworld, and back up 4 steps to get back to the east by morning. And so 4 and 5 were also sacred numbers. There was even a calendar of 819 days, which I believe is 7 times 9 times 13. It has to do with the levels of the heavens and the levels of the underworld. But there are a lot of things that are similar. There are people that say that there are only 7 stories to be told. And you find a lot of stories very similar from different cultures, trying to explain life.
And we're out of time. Enjoyed this thoroughly.
Okay.
You have to come back again and visit with us. My guest today was Charlie Goff, anthropologist. I'm Barry Craig. We will see you next time. Thank you.